Anyways, okay. Hey, thanks for coming. Welcome, Matt. I mean, I don't really know anybody I'd rather have in the club than this guy. This guy is really one of my very, very favorite people on campus. We've worked together for a lot of years, and every time I talk with him or see what he's writing or strategize with him, or we both do similar things at our different churches in the Sojourn Collective. We both preach there when I hear him preach. I just think this guy's amazing. I mean, he is just a huge gift to the church generally and to Southern in particular. So Dr. Jones is the C. Edwin Geens Professor of Christian and Family Ministry. He's also been running our global campus for many years and to great success. And just in the last several months, he's also become the chair of a kind of reconfigured Department of Apologetics, Ethics, and Philosophy. And I can say from my chair in RDS, we're very excited about the future of those PhD concentrations. We're working very closely with him as well. So he's written a lot of books, won lots of awards. He's a good man, a good father, a great preacher, great administrator, and we're just glad to have you here with us.
Thank you very much. All right, what I wanted to do today is just talk through my last research in family ministry. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I'll just kind of let you know what's going in that, I did my PhD, did everything with an aim toward apologetics. That was what I aimed toward. That was where I was headed. Did my dissertation on the psychology of faith and thinking about, again, apologetics and the psychology of faith. I was also, during most of this time, a pastor and a student minister in a very low income, very kind of rough area in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I'd been in ministry, in 2007, I'd been in ministry for about 16 or 17 years. And most of it in that particular congregation in Tulsa. And had been doing family ministry for a lot of those years. And out of the blue, in January of 2007, Randy Stinson called me up and said, "We've heard about what you're doing in your church and you have a doctorate. Would you be willing to come teach family ministry?" That had never been my goal, never been what I was thinking about. And he said, "If you come, you've got to write. You've got to write what you're doing." So I just shifted gears at that point. I really felt like this was the right thing to do. At that particular time, we were at a point in this particular church where I needed to make a decision. Are we going to stay here for the foreseeable rest of our careers, or are we going to go somewhere else? We finished a couple of major building projects and things were going well. The church was healthy. And so this came up in the midst of that. And we thought, this is God's calling us to do this. So I came here and began to teach family ministry here. And that was what I jumped in to doing at that point and began writing in family ministry. And I was glad to do that. In many ways, I saw family ministry as an extension of apologetics because it's about keeping the faith from one generation to the next. So that was how I envisioned and perceived family ministry. So did a lot of writing in family ministry, worked in family ministry. And a few years ago, I just kind of started to let it be known in our administration, I'd really like to move back into apologetics. This is where I started. This is what I was aiming toward. I think we're at a point where that might be able to happen. I didn't see any way of it happening, but if it ever did, I'd be interested in this. That was just the attitude I had on that. And over the last 2 or 3 years, increasingly, and especially over the past year, it really became possible for me to jump back into apologetics. And so I started making plans at that point. I want everything I've done in research and everything like that in family ministry to get out, to get published, so that I can kind of close the door on that and say, I'm done with that. I've said what I have to say in that area so I can move forward. So just started finishing up things and getting things together in this. This is actually what I'm going to talk about today briefly is the last thing I've done in family ministry. This is kind of the closing of the door. Some research I had been wanting to do that I just wanted to wrap up and get in. This is going to go as an appendix in a book that comes out in a year or two called A Theology of Youth Ministry that B&H is doing. And they're doing kind of a historical section at the end, and this is going to be part of that. Is what this is going to be. And so I'll just talk through this briefly. I'm not going to go through it in deep detail, but try to have some time for discussion at the end of this. This started out with the question of where on earth did age-organized ministry come from in the first place? Like, why do we have Sunday school? Why do we have small groups that are age-organized? Why do we even have that? How did that come into existence? Because through much of church history, it didn't exist, and then at some point it did. How did that happen? So that's the question that I initially approached this with, and for a little bit of the reason, not all of it. It was actually, if I'm honest, more my own sheer curiosity. It was a lot of what drove it. But there are some people who have claimed basically that the reason that we have age-organized ministry is this capitulation to certain aspects of progressivism or even Darwinism, or all these different, there's all sorts of different claims about the origins and the nature of having children's classes and youth groups and things like that. And I just wanted to explore what really is, where did this really come from? Now, what I expected to find when I started was that sometime in the 1600s, 1700s, that it was impacted and shaped by the Industrial Revolution and things like that. That's kind of was my hunch, but I wanted to go through. What I actually found was a lot more interesting, to me at least, as well as more complex. But also it went back to, in the form that we know it, and by the form that we know it, I mean gathering a particular age for a particular purpose in a way that the pastor or church leader leads them in some sort of a Bible study or leads them in some sort of discipleship. Okay, that type of a thing there actually originates at some level in Calvin's Geneva. And so what I did as part of this kind of went back in that and went to that. So I'll talk a little bit about this idea of where this comes from and how it originates, in part at least, in Calvin's Geneva. So as many of you are probably aware, in 1537, there was a series of rules, we might say, or organizing principles presented to the Council of Geneva, the Little Council of Geneva by Guillaume Farel, and John Calvin was the co-author of that. This was a time when Calvin was a mere co-author of things, and he was not considered to be the primary guy at this point in 1537 in any way, shape, or form. But they presented these proposals for the government of their city, and part of what they presented were these articles to, in their words, maintain the church in its integrity. And so as part of what they did in this maintaining the church in its integrity, it's that we have to train the children. This was something that is distinct in the Reformation, that really didn't exist in quite the same way in the Middle Ages and even into the latter part as you move into the Renaissance. It is this idea that if we're going to maintain the faith, it's necessary to train the children. This is a very reformational principle. This idea of training the children. And so the idea was we've got to train the children to be able to do this. We have to do this. If we're going to maintain the faith from generation to generation, if we're going to maintain what we have proclaimed as the Reformed faith, it has to be through the children. And so Calvin proposed a plan for how that would happen. Calvin's plan for how that would happen is basically to turn it over completely to the parents, at least in the training of this. He made a catechism, which at that time did not have the question and answer format, by the way. A catechism at that point still meant, this is another thing that becomes popularized in the Reformation, at that point a catechism still meant basically a short summary of faith, something that was short and easily memorable and was brief. So it was a catechism, but it was given to the parents for the parents to be able to train their children in these things. And then at about the time the child is around 10 years of age, the child would be brought before the church and quizzed on this by the pastor. And if the child did not know the catechism, then the child would then meet with the pastor to receive more counsels to be able to know and to understand the catechism. It was more of an informal process in which the parents were the ones teaching and the child was quizzed in front of the congregation at about the age of 10. We find in that Calvin, Luther also did this, actually had a concept, interestingly, of childhood or human development. That human development goes in 3 7-year stages. It's an interesting thing. So from 0 to 7, and then up to about 14, and then up to 21, that still persists in our culture in the fact that all privileges of adulthood kick in at 21. And that can be traced back through all sorts of legal codes, all the way back to this concept of 3 7-year cycles in a child's life. It's actually pretty close to correct, actually, in terms of the way children develop. It's a pretty astute observation that we have from the Middle Ages, and we see this expressed in Calvin and Luther. So in the middle of the second stage of a child's existence, at about 10 years of age, a child was to be quizzed in this way. We see this incorporated into Calvin's Institutes, the first edition in 1536. We see it in these articles of 1537 as well. But of course, as you well know, Calvin, not too long after this, ends up being dismissed from Geneva, and he goes into exile after this time. And it's interesting, Calvin's motivations in the Catechism, before we get into that, he believed that what had happened in the history of the church, and he's not entirely correct about his history here, but is that at one time, this basic procedure had been followed universally by the church, but according to him, the Pope overthrew this, or in his words, the devil overthrew this. The devil got rid of this, and so it was that had once happened, and then it was wiped away at an early stage in the church's history of the rise of the papacy. But nonetheless, he has all these really negative things he talks about to do that. He says that now what we know as confirmation, he's really saying this is not confirmation, what we're doing here. He says Roman Catholic confirmation is, in his words, in which people are decked out like a harlot and they have gesticulations that are more than ridiculous and suited rather to apes than to human beings. Is what he referred to confirmation, which probably refers to the fact, in terms of things suited to apes, what that refers to actually is at confirmation they slapped a child. To slap the devil out of them at confirmation, which I just like, I love this. I love this. Because there have been kids about 12 years of age when I was a student minister, I would love to have had an excuse just to slap them, right in the middle, just to do it. I would have loved to have had that. But nonetheless, they actually did that. At confirmation, they slapped the devil out of the child and just slapped them across the face. And this actually persists in some areas. That one of the rituals is to touch the cheek of the child as a part of confirmation. But that's what it traces back to, is they had smacked the devil out of the child at confirmation. But Calvin is very critical of this and does not desire this to be happening. He says we're not going to restore the theology of the church unless we capture the children. Now, as I said, he was exiled, comes back, as you all know, to Geneva. I don't need to go through all of those things in that, but comes back to Geneva. When he comes back to Geneva, he actually has a totally different plan for how to make all this happen. His plan is he's given up on just giving a catechism to the parents and having the parents take care of it. Calvin is not, he's kind of, not, I don't say completely giving up, but he's realized this isn't going to do it. What he has instead is that the pastor must meet with the children on Sunday afternoons to train them in the catechism. And so what begins to happen in Calvin's Geneva and then slowly elsewhere is the children are gathered in the afternoon on Sunday afternoon, and the pastor teaches them catechism. The pastor's presence is extremely important. And here's why we know this. Calvin also created a set of rules for rural churches, okay? It's very fascinating if you read well, it may not be fascinating to everybody. I thought it was fascinating. Read the different church orders that Calvin produced, and he had these very adaptable ones for urban areas, rural areas, and in rural areas, every church that they worshiped every other week, okay, rather than every week. You didn't have the children's class except on the week that the pastor was there. There was a preacher there. And so, interestingly, he puts this in his formularies along with the pastor's proclamation of the word. In other words, it's fitted right in there. He sees this teaching of the children as an extension of the pastor's calling to proclaim the word. And I think it's just at a practical level, it's important for us to think about that. The pastor had a personal responsibility to disciple the children in the church in Calvin's Geneva and in the environs around it. And indeed, eventually, in all the Reformed churches that followed this order, the pastor had a personal responsibility to train the children. The pastor was responsible for that. And so that's what happens in Calvin's Geneva. We have there this first inclination of a age-organized classes that gathered children together under the tutelage of the pastor to be able to be taught the truth about God, to preserve themselves. Now, one of the interesting things I found was in this research, and when I say interesting, I'm talking about people who are like me, because some of you may be like, that's not interesting. And I think it's interesting. But anyway, so what I found was interesting is within a few years of Calvin doing this, in fact, a very short time afterwards, you have almost identical things showing up in the Book of Common Prayer that emerges in England. And so I thought, okay, there's got to be some connection right here. There has to be some connection. How on earth does the Book of Common Prayer in England so quickly pick up the same formulary about on Sunday afternoons, pastor meets with the children, and the Book of Common Prayer was less frequently, but it was the pastor meets with the children and trains them in a catechism that they may maintain their faith. And so I went on to it.
Was it?
It was Cranmer. It was Cranmer, yes. And so it was like, so I was trying to figure out how this connection, because Cranmer was the one who put it in there. So how is it that they make this connection? And so I started reading Calvin's letters, which are by, has anyone read Calvin's letters? It's a very fascinating thing to read his letters. There's one section where he talks about his kidney stones. And he tells us about his kidney stones and how he rode upon a horse at a right fast gallop and was able to pass a kidney stone. It's like, Johnny C., I didn't want to know that. I really did not need to know that. But Calvin writes all these letters about this. Well, this was letter 229, so I got through 228 letters before I found this one. But anyway, I found the connection of how this occurred, this connection right here. And the connection is through the Duke of Somerset, the Lord Protector of England. He was actually influential on Cranmer, and Calvin and the Lord Protector had a long correspondence with one another. And in this correspondence, just at the time that the Book of Common Prayer is being put together, Calvin says to him, the Church of God will never preserve itself without a catechism. And he spells out for him this plan for how you keep the truth of God in the churches. So this spreads to the Anglican Church, to the Church of England in this time. It gets incorporated into the Church of England. Now, without going into too much detail in a lot of these things in this, the paper that I'm writing, I work a lot more detail into this. This does get picked up, spreads, really, it becomes, even when it's not practiced, it becomes an ideal in the Church of England, even in the times when it's not practiced. So it becomes this ideal that we do this, we practice this in this way through Cranmer as he grows increasingly Protestant. And as you can tell when Cranmer grows increasingly Protestant, as many cases in this, because his beard gets bigger. Like when he's Catholic, he's shaven. And then his beard, by the time he is a full-fledged, he's epic bearddom by this point, okay? And so this was actually fairly common among those who were faithful to the Reformed faith, is they would indicate their rejection of Catholicism and their embrace of the Reformed faith by means of growing a beard. That was an external kind of a third sacrament right there, the growing of a beard. Not really. But anyway, you see this happening frequently, and you'll see it in the artwork. If you just look at that, you can see that happening among them. But it becomes this ideal in the Church of England, and by means of that, makes it over to the American colonies. We find, again, things I find fascinating that you, in fact, may not find fascinating at all. I went through church minutes and church records in the 17th century in Massachusetts, and just looking for what they were doing and found dozens of examples of how this practice of Sunday afternoon, taking the children and training them on Sunday afternoon, was perceived as an ideal that people aspire. Even when they didn't practice it, it was a thing that they thought that they ought to be doing. And so they would do this. An interesting thing that you would see as well, is that they would start doing gender organized ones as well. So the young men would be on Sunday and the young women would be on Monday. So that's something that you start to see in the American colonies as well on that. Jonathan Edwards, during the summer of the Great Awakening, that kind of central summer and the Great Awakening, he actually did that in his home. He invited the children to his home and to be able to learn catechism, and he said he would give them counsels appropriate to their age based on the sermon. So in other words, he would take the sermon down to the level of the kids on Sunday afternoons, and he would invite them into his home to do that. And so as we see all of this, what we see, if we're just kind of, before we move into talking about the early Sunday schools, what we see here is that we have this pattern in which Calvin, to be able to restore and to maintain the Reformed faith, institutes and then adapts after he institutes it. This idea, you see there's Calvin is not nearly as rigid as sometimes people perceive him to be. He tries something, it doesn't quite work. He tries something different. He adapts it for rural churches. He's doing this. This works its way then by means of his correspondence with the Lord Protector of England, the Duke of Somerset, to Thomas Cranmer, which indeed works its way then into the Book of Common Prayer, makes its way over to the American colonies. And what I want to suggest at this point is we have often misunderstood the rise of Sunday school. Because the rise of Sunday school, I went through Robert Rakes's early letters, all of Robert Rakes's letters he wrote about his initial ideas of Sunday school, which he wasn't the inventor of it, but he was certainly the popularizer and the prophet of it, we might say. And what we find in Rakes's early letters is that his purpose in Sunday school was not merely literacy as we often think it was. But his purpose in doing a Sunday afternoon, and it was Sunday afternoon, Sunday school, he did it for the sake of catechism. And what seems to be happening actually in early Sunday school is that Robert Rakes is trying to extend to the poorer classes that which had become the property only of the wealthier classes. Because those that were involved in the churches and whose parents were bringing them, taking them to these Sunday afternoon catechetical classes were all from the upper classes of society. And what Robert Rakes is actually initially doing is extending catechetical opportunity, we might say, beyond those upper classes, which helps to explain some of the early controversy of Sunday school as well. That he is making something available to the children of the poorer classes, the marginalized classes that had previously been available only to the upper classes. And we start to see a unique moment in Sunday school that begins to develop early, in which that is the purpose of Sunday school in this. We see it in a multiplicity of ways, and what we see happening is that the reason literacy becomes worked into Sunday school is because they realize that we cannot teach them catechism if they don't first know how to read. We can't teach them to read the Bible, to know the Bible, if they don't first know how to read at all. Now, when it comes over to the American colonies, we see something that's beautiful and good and short-lived. And that is, in the American colonies, many people, particularly the Methodist churches, of those in the Methodist movement, I guess we could say at that point, was worked to include African Americans, slaves, children of slaves, getting them catechized as well. This starts to happen in the latter part of the 1700s. And if we understand that in context of what I've argued is the larger context of Sunday school, it makes sense. You're trying to use this opportunity of Sunday school to extend to marginalized people that which had only been the property of these upper classes. but it is not successful. I'll read just for a moment some of the things, just a couple of the things that we have in that to do with that. William Elliot, a man named William Elliot in Virginia, taught not only his own children and his indentured servants, but also African-American slaves and servants. He taught them in Sunday school in this. This starts happening in the late 1700s. But as I said, it did not last long, because what begins to happen by the early 19th century is literacy is viewed as empowerment. Now, that's always been the case. Literacy, there's an empowerment in literacy. Literacy is viewed as empowerment. When George Dogaday was in South Carolina, when he started teaching and doing a Sunday school for African-American slaves, he was, it says, severely beaten on the head with a club and subsequently had water pumped on him at the public cistern lest he ever do it again in South Carolina. In this is just one very typical pattern. It's an extremely common one in the early 1800s. But it's seen that, so what we see is the same pattern from England of extending through Sunday school, extending this to marginalized classes, happens in the United States, the colonies, and then the United States, happens at that point. And when it begins to here, what begins to happen is persecution, violence toward those who have the audacity to try to teach slaves to read and to teach them catechism. And that's what begins to happen in the early 1800s. That introduces a fundamental shift in the nature of Sunday school, such that in some sense it is withdrawn from most marginalized people in the 1800s. And it persists that way at some level in Sunday school, especially after the Nat Turner Rebellion in the 19th century, when these laws against, which it becomes eventually laws against slave literacy, become enforced and increased at that time. And so what we begin to see is that by the midpoint of the 19th century, any provision of catechism and things like that and literacy for African Americans becomes reduced, limited, and then eliminated by the midpoint of the 19th century. And so what I want us to think about in that, those are some, just an overview of some things historically in that, is what that says to us about the origins and the function and the purpose and the nature of age organized classes, and perhaps how we should perceive what we do in age organized ministry today. We see from Calvin and some of those to do with that. We see very clearly this adaptability of it. We see in Robert Raikes the power of it to be used for the empowerment of marginalized people. We also see the effect of it when it is understood to be something empowered in those that certain powers wish to keep disempowered. It becomes something that then is contested, rejected, and eliminated for those who are disempowered by powers that want to keep it that way at that point. And I think it should call us to consider our own ministries and to consider what are the ways in which our ministries, without meaning to at times, play the game of catering to those who are already empowered, we might say. And it comes down and it shapes my ministry at the level of as something as simple as, no, we're not going to do a $1,500 a person ski trip with our youth ministry. We're not even going to think about that. Why? Well, because that cuts out a large portion of what we do. We're not going to do this because the purpose of our age organized ministry, one of the purposes historically can be and should be an extension to all of that which could easily only become the property of some. That's one of the things we can do with it, and I think we should see.
Thanks. Okay, I wanted to ask a few questions, so it may be helping your research if it's not done either. So Luther isn't in this, so you can't do everything, but it does seem that he very early on is doing child catechism.
Yes.
Well, how does that fit?
So Luther, interestingly views it much more in an organized, state-sponsored kind of integration of the church's education with the state, we might say, in a way that Calvin, there was a little bit of that, but not nearly the degree. You start seeing the difference between Calvin's Reformation, though it was certainly tied to the state, was actually more able to be shifted and removed. Right.
Right. For Luther, it becomes part of the
But for Luther, it really is. And it's part of his, I mean, of course, Luther in some sense lays foundations for public education. The common school, the public education completely lays foundations for that. And so for him, it's a much more integrated endeavor, less parent dependent for him. The parents are certainly supposed to have a role, but it's less parent dependent for him in that. So, yeah.
Sounds interesting. Maybe it's beyond the scope of this.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I had to, Luther is
I'm just reminded of Joseph Bierman, who we've had in here digitally as well, and his book on virtue in Luther, he talks about how after just a few years in the Reformation, he and Melanchthon start traveling around all these villages and realize they have no idea what theology to believe, and so they institute the catechisms, and everything is built into the education system. Right. Yeah. So, okay. Another just observation, when I've been in Presbyterian and Anglican churches, one of the common things that I don't think we do in many evangelical churches today is a separate children's sermon within the service. Like I grew up in a PCUSA church, and there was always a children's sermon, and I have friends in that world as well. I don't think the PCA probably does it as much. I'm just curious if you know what the fate and history of that has been. It seems like in the non-evangelical denominations, that's probably still there, and then evangelicals don't seem to do that. Is that your experience as well? The children's sermon? Maybe evangelical includes do a bit. Yeah. I don't even know. I think it might even split on the Presbyterian line.
Yeah, I think what happens in that historically is in the early 20th century, you have the efficiency movement that really shapes churches, in which the idea is that it was basically the application of factory mentality to churches. And in that, the idea was get an expert to do something and separate an expertise, separation and expertise on that. Yeah, it really was. I mean, it was really what that same worldview mindset that Ford, the assembly line, comes out of in that way. And
I'm reading Huxley right now. I'm reading Brave New World right now.
It's one of my favorite novels, Brave New World. But what's fascinating in that is the more evangelical the churches, the more apt they were to incorporate the efficiency model, which eventually results in basically we just send the children out to something else and we do something completely separated with them. Whereas those that were less affected by the efficiency model, then they tended to keep the children in, do something for the children in there, because it isn't efficient, but it may be better, but it's certainly not efficient to keep children in the sanctuary in that. And the Southern Baptist Convention jumped on big time in the efficiency movement in a very big way. There's one guy who said, next to the gospel itself, efficiency is the great thing Jesus and his apostles taught. That's how much the Southern Baptists jumped on board with efficiency in the early 20th century. Like it's just nuts. I mean, just like it doesn't even make sense. But they really, there's a lot of papers on this, on the effect of that. Did any of you, just as like the cooperative program really comes out of the efficiency movement of support one big thing rather than a lot of little things, but did any of you come out of churches where you got envelopes weekly that had you marked on, you had your Bible with you, you stayed for church, you did all these things, and you got a grade on that? So they say they were eliminated the grading system on that. This was a big thing and the churches when I was a kid still had these which it's like this is like a Roman Catholic kind of a thing right here of at its worst at that point of checking off all the boxes. But actually those envelopes came out of the efficiency movement. You check all the things you did so you can keep track of. The whole fact that you have the great the tablet of the law in the Southern Baptist Church, that wooden thing that you slide the numbers in. Did anybody go to churches like that have that? Okay, the attendance, everything like that comes out of the efficiency movement. Those come out of we've got to do this. That comes out of the Southern Baptist trying to make sure we count everything and put everything up, how we're doing. Those same type of boards showed up as efficiency measurements in factories in the early 20th century as well. It's just
267 days without an accident.
Yeah, that's that type of thing. So it's that type of a mentality. So I think it has to do with the efficiency movement, and even the more evangelical churches work, the more they adapt to that model.
So one more, for the biggest question is, so I appreciate that what you're saying here is that age organized isn't just a function of modern turn or something, but it does seem something very significant is, and that is the idea of the youth pastor. And you know this field better than I do, but my understanding is that that's really a post-World War II reality, because all of a sudden what happens is after World War II, for the first time in American or really human history, you have a very large middle class with a very large expendable income. And so, and then you have mobile transportation that wasn't available at a wider thing. And so adolescents have free time in a way that they did not before. And that's where rock and roll, and I teach this from the perspective of my music history class. Like the big shift that happens is post World War II, you've got a bunch of teenagers with cars and time, right? And so the result is driving to theaters and a whole new kind of music that's all, rock and roll is a sexual reference. If I ever knew that, that's explicitly a sexual reference is where that comes from. So it was all very rebellious. My understanding was that that's also then the church's response is we need a youth pastor. In other words, we need ministries that are dedicated to that same. So because before that, adolescents hadn't really been identified so much as a group, as much as like they were just adults in training. Right. And they worked on the farm, they worked whatever, but all of a sudden they're not working, they're just in school, they've got time and money. And so the church says, well, we need, and I'm not saying it's wrong necessarily, but that's where the youth pastor comes from. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, generally, yeah. So what you've got is that adolescence had been, for all of human history, a time of preparation for adulthood. Right. And suddenly it becomes a generational, cultural thing that resists movement to adulthood. I mean, that's
its own culture, its own clothing, its own music.
Yeah, you even see it, for example, here's a good example of this. Advertisements. Prior to the midpoint of the 20th century, advertisements for products to be purchased for children or adolescents, where the advertisement was always aimed at the parents. Because the assumption was the parent is the one who buys it. What you see in the around 1950 is the advertising goes directly aimed to the child at that point. That's a fundamental shift right there, because it assumes that the child has agency in the purchase. And before that, the child was not assumed to have any agency in the purchase. But suddenly the child has agency in the purchase. And as this new culture develops, churches at first fail completely to adapt to how do we minister to this other group. Then Young Life and Youth for Christ both emerge. And the youth flock to those. And generally, youth group and youth pastor are formed of a fear on the basis of churches of we're going to lose our kids to Young Life and Youth for Christ. So the idea is we're going to set this group out here, send them out there with somebody who is cool enough to attract youth, but mature enough to survive a deacon's youth pastor. And so we send them out with that, and we'll just send them out in sort of this holding tank with pizza for a few years. And then when they get old enough and they'll mature and they'll come back. In other words, the assumption was if we do this, they will eventually become like us. But that doesn't happen. What ends up then is a further fragmentation of culture, because this group that they sent out never does become like them. It never does return to being like
They just start
us.
sojourn.
They just go start sojourn. Yeah, exactly. And so we have this, and so this whole thing during the 60s and 70s of the Jesus movement and all those things like that emerges out of this fact that these that they send out to this to be the youth group out here never does like become baby boom. They are the baby. They never become the builder generation. That's what they're expecting. They're going to become like the builder generation, but they become their own. And they became their own very self-centered generation in many ways in that. But and eventually when they grow up, we get the 80s and the 90s and the church growth movement in which it's catering to very particular groupings in that. That's really where all that comes from. It's the mentality that grows out of that.
I just saw, maybe somebody knows more about this than I do, but I just saw on Mosier Road where it hits right into the back of Southeast. They just built, I don't know, somebody granted the land or something, but they built this whole beautiful church right behind Southeast. I thought, who is building a church literally in the backyard across the street from Southeast? And it turns out it's a Southeast campus for seniors only. So it's like it's called Chapel in the Woods. I don't know much about it. Do you know anything about it? And so it's like it's another version of Southeast only for people. I don't know if they check your ID or something.
Yeah.
Or AARP
Southeast
membership.
Christian.
Well, it is. So I'm just thinking about how interesting that is. That's on the other end.
Which
There's like a catering.
Those that are going to that,
Because they want something different probably than what's happening in the general.
and those that are in that age group.
That's the
when were they
baby
born?
boomers. Yeah,
That's
for sure
the people that were
baby boomers, right?
born in that time. That's the people, the teenagers of that era are now retiring, and they still have to have their own thing in that. So.
And I wonder, I don't know how much this is involved. I'm not sure if this is true at Midtown, but at East, I know we have a lot of people in their 50s and 60s, who are good giving units, of course, too, who were at Southeast for a long time, and then now have felt like there's not much substance to the preaching, where there had been in the Bob Russell years, been a little bit less, and Dave Stone, and so they feel like, and we've gotten a lot of those people in our church who are now, because they like the meat of what we bring in the sermons, and I can't help but wonder if that Chapel in the Woods is partly Southeast's internal reaction to people wanting something different than what's happening. I don't know. Does anybody know
I think it
anything
makes
about
sense.
it?
Yeah.
I don't know what's happening there. I just have noticed because the construction was really striking. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
They built this beautiful big church, so maybe it's piped in, and if so, then that would help the preaching part of it. But anyways, so it's age segregated on the other end.
On the other end, yeah.
Really weird. So,
How are people like Luther and Calvin developing a theology of youth ministry? What are they appealing to in scripture and in tradition?
And that's the interesting thing is that Calvin, at least, who I can't say, I've read some of Luther on this, but I've read really extensively Calvin on this. I'll just address Calvin. He's simply addressing the fact that children are basically, if we don't capture the children theologically, we aren't going to maintain what we've tried to do in the Reformed faith. He's not appealing to specific example in Scripture. He's appealing to a larger principle of the necessity of training children. And I think that's interesting that Calvin doesn't feel compelled. And we're reminded of that the regular church principle is not something for all of life. It is for worship. Calvin feels perfectly comfortable. He doesn't have to have an exact example in Scripture to do what he's doing here. He feels perfectly comfortable with doing this, simply appealing we have to maintain the children. This is a means by which we maintain the children's theology.
So something like a parachurch ministry.
He seems to be, he doesn't feel, there doesn't seem to be any regret or question about whether that's possible within the range of Scripture.
Dr. Jones, as you were talking about how the pastor would meet with young children on Sunday afternoons, I couldn't help but think. I couldn't help but thinking that there was a potential clash, and I wanted to see if you had investigated this. So, on the one hand, you have, if you studied as reformers, you're probably going, and I haven't done this, but you're probably going to get a strong appeal to all the references in Scripture to teaching children. On the one hand, and on the other hand, you're going to get, these are reformers, so you're going to get a strong sort of anti-anything symbolic on the other hand, right? But on this hand, you teach children through symbols and signs, and that's biblical, right? All the Old Testament things are teaching through signs. Did you see that clash, or did you sense that clash in any of the, like, how did they deal with this? How did they deal with teaching children through signs when they were very anti-sign?
As opposed to like the real strong verbal proclamation.
Yeah, like, the Old Testament specifically says you are to teach through these signs, things that turn into like phylacteries and green and all of this stuff, Sukkot. And on the other hand, you have these people that are against signs, pretty much. Because
So
they were-
where did the flannel graph come from?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting at.
But it is interesting that there's a very strong emphasis. In fact, at one point, Calvin jumped his original catechism and reworked it because he said it wasn't understandable for children. So there's a very clear sense that it's got to be brought down to their level. Very close. This is a recurrent theme over and over, but it is still extremely word-centric. There's no hint that I've seen anywhere of using anything but words in what they're doing. It is extremely word-centric, very logocentric in the way they're expressing this, but also very not saying that we can just teach at whatever level. There's a very deep sensitivity to bringing it down to their level. Now that's characteristic of Calvin. Luther had much broader kind of parameters on that. There's some things that it's unclear whether he did or didn't. We certainly used music, for example, with children. He saw that as something to do with the children. There's all sorts of things. Luther had much more latitude in his mind on that. But for Calvin, for the Reformed churches, it is still very logocentric in the way they do this.
Any other questions? I always appreciate the meticulous care with which you read and study. I appreciate that. Okay, well, great. We're so glad you're with us today. Very good. I'm glad you're doing this work. I think next week is
Dr. Plummer?
do we know what he's talking about?
Yes, but needs to be surprised.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Wow.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So wow, we hope to see you. And then how many more weeks are left? Is it?
So we have the 6th, and then the 13th is the house talk from last week.
Okay.
Yep.
So we'll look forward to that. All right. Thanks so much for coming today. Appreciate it.